This is segment 3 of episode 71 of Ramping Up Your English. While gulls seem a bit scrappy and certainly able to take care of themselves, some bird species as well as other animals need help from humans. In our previous episodes, we saw a number of organizations listed that are dedicated to helping wildlife. Perhaps the most obvious is the National Wildlife Federation. The Wildlife Federation has a long history of getting people to connect with nature, especially the wildlife with which we share the planet. Now, each year they publish a calendar that has award-winning photography showing wildlife. Now, I'm going to show you a number of these wildlife calendars so that you can see what kind of work they do. So here we see one, and actually, just a note from my director, we're a little bit out of order here. This is the one we were going to end on. This is from the land, it's called the Trust for Public Land, very important organization. Here we have one also from the Ocean Conservancy. And so this is yet another organization that helps. Here's the Nature Conservancy. We'll be talking more about that one a little bit later in the program. And then we have one here. This is called the Student Conservation Association, an organization I didn't even know existed till fairly recently. You've probably heard of the Audubon Society. This is one of their calendars. And then there's also the Defenders of Wildlife. All of these organizations offer calendars. There's a couple more I want to show you about. This one is called the National Parks Conservation Association. They do a lot of work with wildlife as well as the scenery, of course, that you see in the national parks. And finally, our last one that I'm going to show at this moment is from the World Wildlife Fund. And of course, they do, as their name implies, work throughout the world to conserve wildlife. So besides helping wildlife by being a member of these organizations, the excellent photography can supply a source, of animal pictures for discussion groups. Now, you may have a connection to the National Wildlife Federation without even knowing it. Have you read a magazine entitled Ranger Rick? That's one of the publications of the National Wildlife Society. Now, National Wildlife Society magazine serves a older readership. And you don't have to stand on your head to read it. You can read it like this, okay? And this is they do a lot of wildlife-based scientific studies as well as efforts to support wildlife by preserving its habitat. Now, in this issue of the magazine, make sure I hold it up correctly. Actually, in the next issue that you see features a story about the return of American bison to the Wind River Reservation. Now, for most Indian tribes, the Great Plains Indian tribes, the bison held a central place in their lives, both for physical needs like food and clothing, and the spiritual role as well. It's an understatement to say that the return of the buffalo, which was facilitated in part by the National Wildlife Federation, working with them and other organizations, including the Eastern Shoshone Tribe and the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, was a major event for the Native American people who abide on the reservation. As one participant in this watershed event put it, the circle is now complete. Scientific staff and project managers from the National Wildlife Federation are often at the table with policymakers and public land managers to help them make informed decisions about supporting wildlife in compliance with federal and state laws. They also certify gardens, yards, schools, and neighborhoods as being wildlife friendly. They also sponsor a night of camping out in nature, if only in your backyard. Now, the biggest conservation organization in the world is the Nature Conservancy. They publish a calendar with high-quality pictures of wildlife that it endeavors to protect. Now, this issue shows a cooperative effort to restore the quality of the Great Lakes. The Nature Conservancy began in the United States by buying up private land and repurposing it to conservation that supports wildlife. Today, the Nature Conservancy has a worldwide reach and employs scores of scientists, project managers, and wildlife advocates. Now, one of their more powerful tools for protecting wildlife is the Conservation Easement. This legal device allows owners of property to receive financial assistance in exchange for managing the land in a way that supports wildlife and allows the owner to make a living on the land. Now, the biggest threat to critical habitat is often development of the land into housing projects, areas that will have houses, shopping centers, and parking lots. Those developments exclude habitat, many important species. So ranches, farms, and woodlands with a conservation easement will remain being used as such, with many owners managing their land for enhancing the habitat of wildlife with help from the Wildlife Conservancy. Now, both of these organizations advocate for policies that protect critical areas for wildlife and engage the public in educational activities and citizen science. They prefer a cooperative approach based on the belief that all people, whether in business or government, treasure the benefits of clean water and air and sustainable economic activity. Smaller regional and local organizations also take a role in conserving and restoring critical habitat. In Oregon, the Southern Oregon Land Conservancy saves high-value land from development using the same tools as the Nature Conservancy: land purchases and conservation easements. Christy Mergenthal of the Southern Oregon Land Conservancy explains the main mission of that agency.
Southern Oregon Land Conservancy is the local land trust. So we're into land conservation, protecting the beautiful lands in Southwest Oregon. We particularly focus on the Rogue Basin in Jackson and Josephine County, and we've conserved about 10,000 acres in this region.
Wow, 10,000 acres.
Yeah, there's this beautiful term, solistagia, and it describes the heartbreak that almost all of us have experienced of losing places, farms, open spaces, places we played when we were kids, and they're altered and overdeveloped. Southwest Oregon is gorgeous, and people will continue to move here.
For that gorgeous
absolutely.
Land.
And we want to conserve a little bit of that landscape: the farms, the ranches, the forests, the streams, the wildlife habitat.
Mergenthaler made her comments on adventures in education on RVTV. Another regional organization with a scientific approach is the Klamath Bird Observatory. Executive Director John Alexander explains how the work of his organization began with an effort to preserve and restore avian life before it qualifies as an endangered species.
The Klamath Bird Observatory grew out of a program called Partners in Flight. And Partners in Flight in the early 1990s was developed as a bird conservation initiative out of concern that many of the land birds or songbirds, birds that frequent our bird feeders, were declining, especially migratory birds across the continent. And the idea of Partners in Flight was to have a very proactive, partnership-oriented conservation initiative that had a dual mission: to keep common birds common and to reverse declines of the most at-risk species. And the nature of this was to try to do this before these species warranted listing under the Endangered Species Act, which starts to become very expensive and problematic as far as proactive conservation. And so many of the large natural resource management agencies got on board with Partners in Flight early on: the U.S. Forest Service, Fish and Wildlife Service, Bureau of Land Management, many different partners like that, really supporting and contributing these efforts. And so we began to work in this area of Northern California and Southern Oregon, recognizing its unique biodiversity, to inventory and start doing long-term monitoring in the various diverse habitats that we have in this area. Starting, really, our data sets go back to 1992.
Science Director Jamie Stevens explains how the careful study of birds can tell us about the health of the ecosystem.
Birds provide a really good indicator of the health of our environment, because when we go out and we monitor birds, we can monitor all the different species at the same time. And because of their high metabolic rate and mobility, they respond really quickly to changes in their habitat. So when we monitor the handful of species, each of those species is going to respond differently to different changes in the habitat. And by understanding what each individual species is doing, we can get a good handle on how our environment is doing.
Stevens and Alexander made their comments in 2015 on Adventures in Education on RVTV. And these are only a few of the organizations that are working to conserve, restore, and enhance habitat for wildlife and for people as well. This large-scale work has benefits for wildlife otherwise threatened by shrinking habitat. Other organizations help animals on an individual basis. When an animal is injured in nature, its chance to survive becomes seriously limited. A raptor that loses an eye or an eagle with a broken wing is unlikely to be successful as a predator. Organizations exist to rehabilitate such animals so they can be released into the wild successfully. One such organization is Wildlife Images in Merlin, Oregon. Executive Director Dave Sidden explains how Wildlife Images has an extremely high success rate in rehabilitating animals that are injured or otherwise traumatized.
I think that we have the ability to slow down and really concentrate on each individual case, and we have amazingly dedicated employees in the clinic area. Plus we have interns. We bring in summer interns, about 10 or 12 every year, that add to that workforce, and then 40 or 50 some volunteers that are dedicated to that. So when you take all those caring people together and you give them the time and resources necessary to complete their mission, they can do amazing things. So a lot of what we do in that clinic area is almost magic. It's pretty amazing to see what goes on a scale that we deal with. Boy, each release is amazing. It's sort of the paycheck for doing all the hard work you've done with all these animals. And of course you have failures and you have successes. But when you take an animal out like the eagle I think you're referring to and release them, we released an eagle on top of Woodrat Mountain here locally, a golden eagle that came in. And that is basically the culmination of so much hard work and so much dedication. And it's amazing. I don't know how you could explain or describe that elation to somebody that's never experienced that. But taking that animal that spent a year with you probably and setting them out in the wild and seeing how well they do. And in this particular case, we were lucky enough to have remote cameras and everything set up to capture that moment. And to share that with individuals is amazing. And we wish we had that opportunity more often. It seems like a very natural fit with the education and rehabilitation because, the rehabilitation makes you feel really good about it, and helping out these 1,000 animals a year is pretty amazing. It makes you feel terrific. But in the long term, the education is probably the more important aspect of what we do. But the rehabilitation allows us to do the education. Some of the patients that really aren't able to go back out into the wild become amazing ambassadors for education. So if you can take that life that basically, each animal that comes in here is essentially biologically dead when it comes in. If you can save their life and put their life to an amazing purpose like education and letting kids get up close and personal and understand how valuable these animals are to us, you can change the world. And I think the education is just critical here. And I really am proud of what our educational department's doing.
Each year, Wildlife Images takes in over 1,000 injured or traumatized wildlife. Some have suffered accidents. Others have been owned as pets and have lost the ability to live on their own, just as their owners have lost the ability to properly take care of them. Whether at Wildlife Images for healing and release, or for the mission of education, these individual animals get the care they need here and at similar rehabilitation centers across the country. Support from the community makes this kind of mission possible.
Support for wildlife populations also comes from zoos and wildlife parks. Now, Wildlife Safari in Winston, Oregon has the most successful captive breeding program for cheetahs in the United States, and the second most successful program in the world. Over 200 cheetahs have been born here, providing a bank of genetic material for sustaining the species, and just in time, too. Cheetah populations in their native land in Africa have been declining due largely to habitat loss. Now, while wildlife safari can't control the habitat loss, they can at least preserve enough animals to repopulate habitat when and if it's restored. And that wraps up this episode of on Wildlife Savers, episode 71. I'd love to hear from you and see how you're progressing with this program. Send an email to letscreatepro@gmail.com. Visit my website at letscreate.org for all the support materials for this episode. Just navigate to the episode 71 page. You can watch and even download all episodes of Ramping Up Your English at archive.org/details/roguetv. Use the search box by entering Ramping Up Your English. You'll find all the episodes there. Ramping Up Your English can be seen in Ashland on Channel 15 or 115 of the Ashland Home Network, and in the rest of Southern Oregon on Charter Cable Channel 182. Showtimes are 8 a.m. on Mondays and 7:30 p.m. on Thursdays. Visit rvtv.sou.edu for free live streaming. Showtimes will vary in other areas. Check your local public access and education stations. I want to thank my director, Denise Ross, and I want to thank my talented and dedicated crew, and I want to thank you, our viewers. All of you helped to make this program an award winner. Join us next time for Ramping Up Your English. I'm John Letts.
You've been watching Ramping Up Your English, a support program for intermediate level English language learners. Learn more. Visit our website at letscreate.org. You can also watch or download today's program at archive.org/details/roguetv. Join us next time on RVTV Voices for Ramping Up Your English.